Welcome. Today we're going to review muscle types and then discuss some of the actions and responses that we see in muscles. So let's review first the first three types of muscles. So if you remember correctly, we have three types of muscles. We have skeletal muscle, we have cardiac muscle, and we have smooth muscle. And they're all different in a couple different ways. So let's start with skeletal muscle. So skeletal muscle is what's called voluntary, and that means that you can move it by thinking about it. And it is the only muscle type that you can do that with, so it's very special that way. It's also striated, which means that it is striped. So if you look up here, you can actually see the striping on the muscle fibers or muscle cells. And if you remember, the reason that we see striping is because we have two different kinds of proteins in there. We have the myosin and actin protein. So we have striped cells. The job of skeletal muscle is to move bone. So it is attached to bone by tendons, and as muscles shorten, those tendons pull on the bone, and that causes movement. Skeletal muscle is also multinucleated. That means that there is more than one nucleus per cell, which is a little weird. Most cells we think about only have one nucleus per cell. The reason it has more than one is that helps your muscles to be very coordinated and to react very quickly when you call on them to move. And lastly, skeletal muscle is stimulated to move by the neurotransmitter acetylcholine, which we abbreviated ACH. And acetylcholine is released from the neurons, and when it is received by the muscles, it causes a muscle contraction. All right, so cardiac muscle. Cardiac muscle is not voluntary, it is involuntary. In other words, you cannot move cardiac muscle by thinking about it. Cardiac muscle is also striped. If you look up here, you can see the stripes. And cardiac muscle is, interestingly enough, called autorhythmic, and that means that it can beat all at one time. So all of those muscle fibers contract at the same time, which is very important for you to beat your heart. And we know that cardiac muscle is only found in the heart. One of the ways that cardiac muscles are so quick to respond, despite not having more than one nucleus, is the way the muscle cells fit together. So those muscle cells fit together by something called an intercalcated disc, and that's all these dark areas up here in the striping. And intercalcated discs are just the way those two muscles are stuck together. It is that intercellular junction. And it's such a special intercellular junction with these tubes to allow information to pass back and forth between cells very quickly. And this is what allows the autorhythmicity of heart muscle. And then the last type of muscle is smooth muscle. Smooth muscle is also involuntary. You cannot move it by thinking about it. But smooth muscle is non-striated or not striped. And if you look up here, you can see that. Smooth muscle is found in the digestive system, in the walls of your arteries and your veins, and it does a very specific job for you in the body called peristalsis. And peristalsis is the rhythmic contraction of smooth muscle to push food through your digestive tract. So from your stomach to your small intestine, to your large intestine, to your anus, and then out of your body. Again, you're not thinking about that to move it, but it is moving thanks to your subconscious. And lastly, smooth muscle is stimulated by a different neurotransmitter called norepinephrine. So instead of acetylcholine, we have norepinephrine. So those are some of the differences between the three types of muscle fibers. All right, let us move on. So, muscle fiber types. So in terms of muscle fibers, there are two categories, those that contract quickly and those that contract slowly. We call these two categories fast twitch muscle fibers and slow twitch muscle fibers. And we're going to start with slow twitch muscle fibers. So let's go ahead and write slow twitch. Always leave out my C. And slow twitch muscle fibers you can think about in terms of a marathon runner. These fibers are often called red fibers or dark fibers. And that is because they have an abundance of the pigment myoglobin. And myoglobin is what carries oxygen in muscle cells. So these muscle cells are very well supplied with oxygen. They also have more mitochondria. and that allows them to have an ever-abundant supply of ATP. So these muscle cells do not fatigue very quickly. They can really keep up with ATP production. And this is why marathon runners can run 26 miles at one go. Fast-twitch muscle fibers are a little bit different. And fast-twitch muscle fibers are often called white fibers. And that is because they don't have that myoglobin that we see in slow-twitch muscle fibers. And then that means that they aren't producing a lot of oxygen, and they don't have as much ATP. They have less mitochondria, which means they have less ATP. But one thing that they are very good at is releasing calcium. And very quick at releasing calcium. And that means that when those muscle fibers are called on to respond, they can do so very quickly. This is what allowed Usain Bolt, here our fastest man on Earth, to excel at the Olympics. His fast-twitch muscle fibers give him such great speed, but he can't sustain that speed for very long because those muscle fibers will fatigue very quickly. You can also think about this in terms of animals. Migrating birds and wild birds often have a lot of dark meat on them, like turkey, and that's because they are utilizing their muscles for longer periods of time. Chicken, on the other hand, has a lot of white meat, and that is because chickens don't fly very much. They might need to escape a predator once in a while and get up in a tree, but they don't really need to sustain activity for long periods of time. So they just need that quick burst of energy like Usain Bolt. Okay, so let's talk about types of contractions. So our first type of contraction is called an isotonic muscle contraction. And isotonic muscle contractions are where the muscle fiber is shortening and their attached ends, the ends that they attach to, move closer together. So this is where we have equal force, but a change in length. And good examples of that would be like lifting a dumbbell, like this little child down here is lifting. I think that's Photoshop. So isotonic force, isotonic contraction, equal force, but a change in the length of the muscle, so a shortening of the muscle, which causes movement that you can visibly see. So take a moment right now and think of two other types of isotonic contractions and write those on your paper. All right, the next type of contraction that we see is an isometric contraction. And isometric contractions are the opposite. Instead of having a change in length, we have a change in force. And muscles stay the same. So this is where you are pushing against a wall or planking, like we see in these pictures to the left here. So they have assumed this prone position and they tense their body up and they hold that position. So isometric contractions, we have a change in force, but the muscles stay the same. So take a moment and write two other types of isometric contractions that you can think of. Skeletal muscle provides a variety of body movements. Each muscle movement depends on two factors. The first factor is the kind of joint that is associated with the particular muscle. And the second factor is the way each of the muscles that are involved in moving that particular joint attach on either side of that joint. So here we see a hinge joint, that is the elbow. And if you look, the hinge joint is moving in one plane, and that is because of the way the biceps and the triceps muscle move in relation to that particular joint. They attach on either side, and that's what allows you to flex and move back your elbow joint. If you remember, we discussed the way muscles move in terms of levers. You have a rigid bar, a fulcrum or pivot point, and you have a force that moves against resistance. So let's take a closer look at that. So again, we're going to look at the elbow joint here and how the forearm moves. And if we're talking about the lever, we have the rigid bar, and in this particular case, that would be the humerus bone. And then we have the fulcrum, which would be the elbow joint that pivots. And then we have the force, which here, if we're moving our forearm towards us, is going to be the biceps muscle. So that's how we see that lever is working. Always in muscles, one side of the muscle is attached to a stationary bone and one side is attached to a movable bone. And so here, if we're looking at the biceps, this is going to be the point that is stationary, that's not moving as we bend our elbow and flex or pull our forearm into us. And this is the point that's going to be attached to that particular, to the movable portion. And so we have two names for that. The part that is stationary is called the origin of a muscle, and the part that moves is going to be origin and insertion. And so that part of the muscle or end of the muscle is going to be the insertion. And when the stationary side is moving, it's going to be moving back towards the origin. When muscles contract, the insertion, like we said, is moved towards the origin. Some muscles, like the biceps, have two particular origins. So if we looked up here, we would actually see two heads, which is why we get the name biceps for two. Some even have three, like the triceps muscle. And most movement occurs because muscles act in groups, and they're acting together. Most muscles are arranged into what we call opposing pairs around a joint, and that's just what we saw. The biceps and the triceps move opposite one another. A muscle that causes a desired action is called a prime mover, and a muscle that has the opposite effect to the prime mover is called an antagonist. So looking at what we just looked at here, the biceps is going to be what we call the prime mover. This is just another word for it, the agonist. And the triceps, which is causing the relaxation, or the opposite of the desired action, is called the antagonist. And we have a couple additional names for muscle actions, and that is synergists and fixators. And synergists are muscles that aid in movement. And so if we are looking at the flexing of the biceps muscle here to, let's say, curl a dumbbell, one of the muscles that acts as a synergist is the brachialis. They work in tandem to help you curl your biceps. Another particular type of, so that's a synergist. Some muscles that help the prime mover, and fixators are muscles that help to stabilize. So a stabilizer when doing a biceps curl is the trapezius in the back of the neck and the shoulders, because when you're doing a forceful action like that, your scapula would likely move if you didn't have the trapezius holding it down and preventing the scapula from moving. So that would be a fixator muscle. All right, let's talk about muscular response. So how do we know how muscles respond? Well, scientists can either isolate a muscle from a body or use a long needle, like we see here, inserted into a muscle, and hook it up to a computer, stimulate it with electricity. That's why it has electrode down here. And then a computer can record how that muscle responds. The first thing you need to know is that muscle fibers will not respond until they reach a high enough level of stimulation. And that is what's called the threshold stimulus. So they have to have enough stimulus to get to that one point. And then after they get to that point, they will contract. I think that this video is a good example of the threshold stimulus. You see this little black cat, and he starts to taunt the orange cat. And the orange cat is sitting there, and sitting there, and sitting there, and then bam! He hits that threshold stimulus of irritation, and he takes the little black cat out. So your muscles are a little bit like that. They are not going to react just like that orange cat didn't react until they get to that certain point, that threshold stimulus. Once muscles respond and we have some sort of electrode attached to them to the computer, we can record the results, and those results are called a myogram. And here is a picture of a myogram. And if you notice, myograms have, Sorry about that. Okay, so myograms have 3 particular periods. This is a myogram. And so we have this period here, this latent period. We have 2, a contraction period, and we have 3, a relaxation period. And so the latent period is the period before stimulation. And that's when a muscle has not been stimulated to contract, it has not reached that threshold stimulus. And here, this particular point is that threshold stimulus when it's going to begin to contract. So then we have the period of contraction, and once we hit that point where the muscle is no longer receiving the stimulus to contract, then we have the relaxation period until that muscle returns to its original state. Your muscles respond in what's called an all or nothing manner, all or none manner. In other words, one muscle fiber is stimulated to contract, and it's going to do so to its maximum ability, to the most possible. It doesn't ever do anything halfway. So how can we then push gently with our legs or push really forcibly with our legs if all of our muscles are responding in this all or none fashion? And the way that we can do that is because it has to do with the number of muscle fibers that are contracting. For large muscles that have many fibers, the number of fibers that respond depends on the level of stimulation. So if we're looking at this bundle of fibers and we are looking at this in, let's say, the quad muscle, and we want to push gently with our muscles, we might only have half of the muscle fibers respond. Now those half are going to respond all or nothing, and they're going to respond to the most possible. But because we only have half of them for a particular muscle responding, it's going to be a more gentle force. If we wanted to push forcefully with our legs, then we would engage all of those muscle fibers, and in doing so, we would have a more forcible level of response. So as stimulation increases, the muscle fiber response increases. This is what we call muscle recruitment. So muscle recruitment, again, as your stimulation increases, the body recruits more muscle fibers to respond. It's also important to remember that the number of muscle fibers in motor units varies. So some motor units have maybe 1 or 2 muscle fibers, and some may have 20. For places where you need really precise movements, then you're only going to have a few. For places where you don't need as much precision, but you need a lot of force, a lot of action, then you're going to have many. And examples of that would be your biceps or your quads. And places where you have few muscle fibers and motor units is going to be like your eyes, which need very precise movements to read and to do other things and to focus. So muscles can be named for a number of their different attributes that we're going to go through now. And the first way that they can be named is their direction. And by direction I mean the way the fibers run in relation to the midline of the body. And we talked about several different muscles that have a directional term in their name. One of them is rectus, and another one of them is oblique, and then another one of them is longus. And all of those terms deal with the way those particular fibers move in relation to the midline of the body. The second way is with size, and we talked about a couple muscles that have a size term in their name. The gluteus maximus indicated that that is the largest muscle of the gluteal trio, and the minimus is the smallest, so minimus maximus. The third is shape, and we had a lot of different muscles that are based on their particular shape. We had orbicularis, indicating orb or sphere. We had trapezius for trapezoid. We had delta that represented the triangular shape. So a lot of different muscles get their name for their shape. I would say that the shape and the action are the most popular ways to name muscles. We have how many origins they have. And so a couple muscles in our bodies have more than one origin point. So biceps, because they have 2 heads, have 2 different origins. And triceps, because they have 3 heads, have more than that. So this is what, 4? Origin. And so we have the biceps, 2, and we have the triceps, 3. All right, and then we have, we're going to pretend that we're back on the other one. Don't ignore this. So 5 is location. And a good one for location is the frontalis. So because it's located in your frontal region. And then this one is number 6. And this is for the number or place of insertion. And the brachioradialis is a good example of insertion point because it's telling you that the insertion of that muscle is on the radius bone. So lots of different ways that we can name muscles. All right, so let's talk about some muscle actions and how some muscles work in terms of their particular movements. And I grouped them in pairs in terms of the action and the reaction. So the first one is movement up and down, or towards the head or towards the feet. So muscles that act to move objects towards the head or in that particular, and lots of muscles do lots of different actions, but if we're talking specifically about a movement upwards or towards the head, we call those muscles levitors. So they produce a superior, so towards the head, so a superior movement. And so the converse of that is going to be the depressors, and those are going to produce an inferior movement. Okay, so levitors, superior, depressors, inferior. The next are going to be the adductors and abductors, and this is not going to be superior, inferior. Here we are talking medial or towards the midline and lateral. So muscles that move us towards the midline are called adductors. So produce movement towards the middle, and abductors produce movement towards the side. Good examples of that are your hip muscles. Muscles in your hip can do both adducting and abducting. So if you were using your muscles of your hips to bring your knees together, that is an adducting motion. And if you were opening up your legs and moving your knees further apart, that is an abducting motion. All right, next we have pronating and supinating. And pronating is, and supinating is more of a movement or rotation. And so if you are pronating, then you are taking your upward facing palm and moving it down. People that pronate when they run, their feet roll inwards. And then supinator is where you are taking your downwards facing palm and moving it or rotating it upwards. And so people that are supinators when they run roll out. So pronating versus supinating. And then the last one is sphincter muscles. And sphincter muscles are muscles that produce closing. And we talked about how the orbicularis oris, the mouth muscle, is a circular muscle because sphincter muscles are circular muscles. And they close the diameter of a particular muscle. So muscles, thankfully, don't need a whole lot of care and maintenance, but they do respond to large changes. And so there's a couple different types of muscle characteristics that we can see. And the first one is called hypertrophy. And these are great examples of hypertrophy. And hypertrophy is an enlargement of muscles. And that can be because of exercise and that you are using those muscles more. And great classic example of that is Arnold Schwarzenegger, a Hollywood star who is very buff. And hypertrophy can also, unfortunately, be aided by steroids. But this guy is just crazy with his hypertrophy. And then the opposite of hypertrophy is atrophy. And atrophy is where muscles are not used and they go away. The fibers shrink in diameter and you actually lose muscle mass. And this is a great example of atrophy. A lot of times this happens when somebody has been in a cast and they have not been using their muscle because it's been immobilized. And so here, this is the healthy looking hand where you actually see the definition of muscle in the hand. And here, that's really sunk in and it's kind of gone away. And then you can really see the diameter of the leg here. And this leg was in a cast for a number of weeks and this leg wasn't. So muscles really respond to use and disuse. So that's really an important aspect of care of muscles, disuse. All right, so a couple different muscular disorders that I want to talk about, and the first is Botox. And Botox is something that we use in medicine for both relief of pain and for cosmetic surgery. And it is, we obtain it from bacteria, so it's a bacterial toxin. And we take that bacterial toxin, which is one of the most toxic substances on the planet, and we inject it into people's faces. And what that does is it paralyzes nerves. And if you paralyze nerves in the face that cause wrinkles, then those wrinkles go away. So Botox is pretty interesting. But it can also be used for good. If people have overactive muscles that cause painful twisting in the neck, we can use Botox to help relieve some of the the hyperactivity of those muscles so people aren't in a lot of pain. So I want you to watch this video on Botox.
Remember Saddam Hussein's biological arsenal? He raised bacteria with the graceful name of Clostridia botulinum. It causes botulism, a kind of food poisoning we got to know too well before processing methods were improved.
When we eat it, we get deathly ill, and we die. It's about as potent a poison as is known, actually. Pound for pound, it will kill more things than anything else.
6 million times more deadly than rattlesnake venom. It is the most toxic substance on Earth. Botulinum toxin could be such a powerful weapon that it's been drafted for war since the 1940s. Scientists suspected there might be a use for the toxin. Ed Shantz began his study of the toxin while working for Army intelligence during World War II. Until his retirement, he supplied all the botulinum toxin used in scientific and medical research in the nation. Eric Johnson has worked with him for the past 13 years.
We purify it by several purification steps, and there's, I would say, 50 milligrams of toxin in this vial here, which is maybe 1 million lethal doses, so obviously we're very careful with how we handle it. Want a sample?
After all his years of research, Dr. Shantz had the imagination to see another application for the toxin.
At first, it started with a small bit of pain at the base of the neck, and then eventually, as I'd be driving the car, all of a sudden my head would go to the left. The only way I could get it back was to take my hand and push it back.
Howard Thill suffers from spasmodic torticollis, a painful disorder caused by hyperactive muscles that twist the neck and can permanently tilt a person's head to the front, back, or side. About 150,000 Americans suffer from this condition. Dr. Shantz wondered, since the toxin paralyzes muscles, perhaps a tiny amount would relax overactive muscles. At 1/1000th the lethal dose, the deadly toxin becomes a healer.
And the minute I got my first injections, the pain was gone. I mean, it was just, it was a great, great feeling. My life had been given back to me. It's ironic when you take a toxin that can kill people, and all of a sudden it's saving lives. antibiotic, and it's a great thing.
Clostridia botulinum is a strange organism. Under the right conditions, it grows quickly into a large population. Then the cells destroy themselves, the bacteria die, and the deadly toxin is released.
To start a batch of toxin and complete it for medical use, it takes about 3 weeks. And in that time, we can prepare enough toxin to supply the medical profession for many, many years. And all of it in a tiny tube, as you see on the bench.
There is promising research that botulinum toxin will help millions of people suffering from conditions associated with hyperactive muscles, such as Parkinson's disease, cerebral palsy, multiple sclerosis, and stuttering.
Okay, and then the last issue or thing that I'd like to talk about medically with muscles is what's called rigor mortis. And rigor mortis is where you have a stiffening of the body after death. So it usually happens 24 to 48 hours after death, and the entire body goes into a sustained contraction. The entire body, every muscle contracts. So the body is stiff as a board. And the reason that happens is because calcium is not moved back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. ATP isn't being produced to allow any of the actin and myosin heads to come apart. And so that's what causes that particular stiffening or that long protraction. After about 72 hours, the muscle fibers actually start to decompose, and that's when the body softens again and is usually embalmed for a funeral or for a viewing. But rigor mortis is an interesting phenomenon that happens after death. Okay, and the last thing I'd like to show you is a video I found.
Here we have our NeuroBridge device connected with EMG.
That shows a human and a frog's muscles being connected.
The signal gets processed through the NeuroBridge circuit and sent to stimulate the muscle of the frog.
So as he's moving his arm, it's causing the muscle in the frog's leg to move, which is just crazy.
See, as he flexes his forearm muscle, the muscle of the frog is
And here he does a longer, forcible contraction. All right. Well, now you need to start working on your practice test.